It's very, very good to be here, and thanks for letting me squeeze into what really would only work for me, and it seems to have worked for a few of you, and I know it's just before Easter, so I do appreciate that. I am very passionate about this topic, and I want to try and show you why, and hopefully give you something that will be valuable. A set of tools, actually. I want to give you a set of tools. And it's all about this pitching research. Now, there's actually two papers behind this talk, and for me, a little measure of success is if I convince you that there's something worthwhile here, that you would actually access those papers. There's so much more information, advice, etc. in the papers that I'll just have no time to talk about now. So the base paper is actually the pitching research paper itself, which is only in version 13. I don't think I'll ever get it right. Perfection is really not what I'm after. I do the best I can, but I know it's not perfect. And I'll continue to update it. Basically the reason I want to do that is it's the go-to. It's like the one-stop shop for everything I'm pouring into this. And right at the end of the talk, I'll actually give you a bit of a flavour of the resources and the stuff that I am doing to try and share with as many people as I can. So that's the base paper. Now, the companion paper is a paper that I've done with Tim Castell, a colleague of mine at the business school. Tim is who I see as a guru in innovation and sort of social media and really the brains behind the second paper. And we worked on this together, and it's the engagement and impact one. So it seemed to me, after a quick chat this morning, that rather than just tell you about the base paper, which was my initial plan, I should really pivot and tell you a little bit about the base paper, but tell you more about the engagement and impact one. But one of the messages I'm going to drive home to you is they're a pair. They've got to go together, and I'll tell you why as we get into it. So, the four goals, a bit of a roadmap, provide a brief background and my journey, and I'll try and make that brief, but it's partly just to convince you that I'm heavily invested in this. And I've either got it terribly wrong, and I hope I haven't. Let's rule that out, but maybe I have got it terribly wrong, so I'm over-investing in something that's just wasting my time. Or I've got it right, and therefore it's a big, big journey that I'm on. Then I'm going to explain how the framework works, and there are the two components and sort of some underlying philosophy. I'll cherry pick some of that for you. I'm then going to pitch you a worked example. Now I have to apologise in the following sense that the worked example is a finance one. It's not overly technical. So I think you won't have too many problems, at least at the intuitive level of what it's trying to do. The other version of the talk I actually pick an example, that I'm always confident no one in the room has any knowledge of, but we're not going to do that one. There's probably no one's really in finance here anyway, so at least the other one was a little bit more humorous, but it'll work, trust me. And then right at the end, very briefly, I'll just point to the resources. What I should say is I'm happy to share the slides, and in slide view there's a whole bunch of, there's several slides where the links, particularly at the end, the links are live. So if you're connected to the internet and you're in slide view, you can hover over it, you'll see the address. If you click it, it'll take you to that resource. So I'm happy to share those. Alright, so here's one measure of how serious I am about this. I mean, it didn't cost a huge amount, but it's not zero either, but I've actually got a trademark on the pitching research logo, which you see there. I won't bore you with that. I have given this talk a few times, 180 actually. This is the 180th of this nature. 37 different countries and 36 universities. So I'm very proud to have CDU up there in red now, so all the red ones I've been to. So, I've pretty much got the main ones. And I've got a date lined up for Charles III. So, it's a crazy little goal. Crazy goal of mine to see all the universities, and I've almost got there. So, now, as I said, I've just come from the Czech Republic, and I did 2 talks there, and a few other countries in Europe. And in terms of the countries around the world, so the journey I've been on in the last 2 weeks, I went to Japan first of all, and I gave 2 talks in Japan, then across to the Czech Republic, and now back here. The ones in green, they're webinars, so that's one way of trying to get out there with a little less travel and a little, it's more impersonal, however. I'm always on the lookout for new gigs, and I think just in the trip that I've been on, I've got leads on Korea. And I've got quite a few leads in Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, so Latvia, Croatia, and a few others, Bulgaria, and so I'm going to get around. And that was, I'm going to read Chinese, that was the publicity for the Chinese, Japanese. Right, see, that's jet lag for you. I have to thank my dean, the dean of the business school. I couldn't possibly do all that stuff, because that's making me feel a bit nervous. So, I couldn't do it all without the great support of the dean. So, and then my favourite cartoon character. So, what is that famous cartoon character wearing? Can you tell? What?
Stethoscope.
Beg your pardon?
Stethoscope.
Stethoscope. It's a bit cryptic. Yeah, well, it's actually, I was thinking of it as, well, I'll say it as a doctor's coat, on the pitch doctor. Okay, that's fine. All right, let's go from that to something that's more relevant to the point. We all have a concept of what research is, and it probably makes sense just for us to very quickly refresh our memories and maybe come to a consensus, at least for the purposes of today and this morning, as to what research is about. What is research to you?
Finding out stuff.
Finding out stuff. Can you catch?
I don't know.
Right, finding out stuff. So, I don't mind that suggestion. I'm going to run out of these. The thing is, there's a whole bunch of things that is about, can be described as finding out stuff, but isn't research. So, yes, but we can do better. So what is research?
Asking questions.
Asking questions.
You just wanted a ball.
You just wanted a ball. All right, a couple of other suggestions. They're not, we're very general at the moment.
I think it's a journey rather than a destination, because it's never ending. There's always something beyond that.
True. It's like you're defining something that's quite vague. I think we can do better. Yes.
Sharing your knowledge.
Sharing a knowledge again. Woo.
It's adding to knowledge. It's adding new knowledge.
And
I've already got one. Full.
You got one, right?
I've got one in my office as well that I use.
Okay, I'm nearly out anyway.
I don't need one.
Well, I think I need a ball. It's to look to innovate.
Look to innovate. So was it? Oh.
Collecting evidence to support a new point or statement or aspect.
Yeah. Have you got one of these yet?
No.
No, it's not okay. You've got it. Whoa.
Oh.
Okay. All right. So here is something that the ARC have told us, and it's not that. No, I should be careful what I say because we're going to tape. Anyhow, this is from the Engagement and Impact Assessment Pilot, which I'm not sure whether you're aware, but they're doing this pilot because in 2018 it's going to be on for real. And extracted from the submission guidelines. So the creation of new knowledge and or the use of existing knowledge in a new and creative way so as to generate new concepts. So new is in there 3 times. So newness, novelty, knowledge. It can involve existing knowledge, but it has to be in a new and creative way. And in fact, new concepts, methodologies, inventions, and understandings. So that's okay. This last little bit's interesting and sort of in a way reassuring, because it's allowing for us to, even where there's synthesis and analysis of previous research, if that's done in a new and creative way so that we have new insights, then that's deemed to be research as well. Okay? So, research engagement. What's research engagement about? Yep.
Getting people to use the research?
Getting people to use the research? What people?
Oh, it depends what field you're in, the target audience. So
Target
it would be
audience.
the health, Indigenous health
Yep.
centres.
Yep.
Stakeholders, not
Stakeholders, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's the dissemination of the newly created knowledge.
Beneficiaries of it. Yeah.
Beneficiaries, but dissemination.
Don't
I
forget
think
it's
you're probably, and maybe there's sort of a grey area here, but you're probably heading in more the impact part. So engagement is possibly a sort of an intermediate step to get that impact. Anything else?
It's accessibility to people that need.
Accessibility. I think that's probably still going that extra step.
It's working with people.
So here again is from the submission guidelines of the EIAP. Research engagement is the interaction between researchers and research end users. And we had a couple of, no one used end users, but actually, I don't dislike what you suggested, but end users is actually neat, and it's sort of quite generic, but it's really saying that someone at the end of the line, and maybe they're not too far away or too distant really, they have to have some need for the research, including industry, government, non-government organisations, communities and community organisations, for the mutually beneficial exchange. Mutually beneficial. So it's useful to them, but it should be useful to the producers of the research as well. Of knowledge, technologies and methods and resources in a context of partnership and reciprocity. Okay. So what is research impact? Well, I think we were getting some suggestions that really touch on this one more than the engagement. They are somewhat similar, but I think most people would see them as different as well. And again, from those submission guidelines, research impact is the contribution that research makes to the economy, society and environment beyond the contribution to academic research. Beyond the contribution to academic research. So the research we do at universities and institutes and the like should mean something and have a value to a scholarly community. What we're talking about with, if someone says what's the impact of that, they usually have in mind the impact beyond the scholarly community. That's not to say we shouldn't have and strive for impact within the scholarly community, but this is beyond the academic research. But why bother? Now, for this group, I'm suspecting you might almost be offended by that. It's sort of like, well, why bother with stuff that's too scholarly? But normally, when I go to universities, I suspect this is particularly professors or academics that are about my vintage, been around too long maybe, some of them, living in the 20th century still. That's their response. It's like, the only thing that matters is what has always mattered. And of course, that's not the case anymore. So until the pilot exercise that I referred to before was on the horizon, I think a few people thought, well, I guess it's just related to the excellence of research in Australia, the ERA. But it's not exactly that, and in fact we know now that because of the foreshadowed exercise for 2018 and the pilot for 2017, quite a number of the researchers in universities have to start thinking more about their engagement and their impact. At least those that are at the decision-making levels of universities, they're scratching their heads thinking, well, across all of our areas, we better make sure that we've got a pretty good footprint in this zone. So, what is the hardest thing about doing engaging and impactful research? So I'm gathering there's quite an experience at this in the room. What would you see as being some of the big challenges of doing that? Having research that has this engagement and impact.
Making sure you take the community along with you, that they help you pose the problem or ask you to solve the problem, that you do the process together, that it has real use and benefit to the people who've asked for the help, sort of.
So what I liked about your response is the focus on the problem, and it's the problem that sounds to me like it's more than likely sourced in the zone of the end users, if you like, so the community. And so having that, and this is I guess where the engagement bit should take place, that you're having a meaningful and rich communication with the end users, so you really are achieving some of those goals that if you didn't have that engagement, you may or may not. It could be a bit hit and miss. So, yeah.
Funding?
Funding?
Often processes that are happening in the uni that we've got to work with.
Yeah, processes. Yeah, no, all those processes are there to help us, of course, but sometimes we feel like they could be a hindrance. But yes.
I think it's the controversy around the research topic and the various ethical issues that might arise, which prevents the research from being conducted. I mean, for instance, we know what happened with Bob Fraser's research at UQ, right? With the bus thing.
Yeah, actually, I remember. I've forgotten about it. But yeah, I mean, it can be controversial, and I suppose, like any research we do, we have to sit back and weigh up all the pros and cons, and sometimes the controversy happens. We don't actually, we couldn't have sort of forecast that it would. But yeah, so I accept that one.
I think evaluating some of the indirect and direct benefits of impact, particularly when you're not doing a technological type of knowledge contribution, where it's more methods or services or that. So I think particularly in the area of social sciences and ecology, for example, that can get tricky. So
measuring the impact, having some view that you can, with some some objective criteria to say that you had a success. I agree with that. Yeah, one more.
How do I put it? Understanding the culture of the community that you're working with.
Yes.
So we're coming from an academic culture, which sometimes is in the complete opposite way that the cultures that we work with function, and having the patience to actually go about things a different way. And trying to explain that to ethics.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good one as well. Most academics, aren't they? Well, human nature actually is, we're pathetic at putting ourselves in the shoes of another party, particularly if it's not in this case it's not really an opposing party, but that's the classic case of we can never see it from the other side, and even if it's another a stakeholder that is compatible with what we're trying to do, academics get very sort of narrow-minded and fixated on what makes them excited, and if they're not tuned into what the end user wants, well, it could be just a disaster or a total waste of time anyhow.
There's also that building in that additional layer of into the research to be able to measure the engaging and impactfulness.
Yes.
So knowing how to do that.
Yep. So I think a lot of the things we just talked about we'll see in the framework that I want to share with you, and some other things as well, but it won't be everything. But the next slide reveals, I guess, a bit of a theme in terms of what it's trying to do. Whoops, I will skip over. Well, we can talk about, from an individual's point of view, the capability, the capacity, the agility, the timing mismatch, whether you're going to be exploited, particularly if you're a PhD student and you're going to do a little internship or whatever, out with an industry partner. One that always gets me, and has for many years, is the independence issue. So you don't really want to be, you don't want to feel, this is my view anyway, you don't want to feel like you're a guns for hire. So the industry, the end user has a particular answer they want, and you know that very early on, and if you don't provide that answer, then they're not going to be happy, and most people, I suspect, don't really want to be in that position. You want to have independence, and you want to, as much as you can, bring evidence to the table that helps us understand what the truth, in air quotes, because we'll never know the truth mostly, what the truth really is about the area and the research question that we've set. And not forgetting our scholarly goals. So, I think we could talk about that for a long, long time, and I just wanted to put that flavour in but move on. So depending on the way you look at things, it's sort of like the glass half full, glass half empty. You either see a whole bunch of those things as challenges, or there's some opportunities there. And maybe there's sort of a bit of a mix when it really is all said and done. So getting back to the question, planning. So I think what happens quite a lot is we go off and maybe not so much here, but my observation in a lot of universities is the researchers go off and just do their thing, and then at the end when they've published the work and someone says, so can you show us how you've engaged and you've been impactful, they sit and look at after everything's done and go, okay, let me think, and sort of be a bit creative and a bit inventive, and of course it's far too late by then. I mean, it's much better to if this is where you want to be, that's a big question, and some of us, this is exactly where we want to be, then we should plan as best we can. Because if we plan our engagement and impact, we'll have a strategy, and my argument will be we can't compromise the scholarly goals. So an extreme case of compromising the scholarly goals is basically to completely ignore them, to throw them out, and we do this engaging and impactful sort of activity, and it's probably not going to be research. It's probably going to be consulting or contract research, but doesn't have that scholarly angle to it. That's not to say some of those activities of consulting and contract research aren't valuable and important, but universities at the end of the day need to make sure they've got the scholarly side covered, because that's where the long-term reputation lies. So let's not jeopardise our long-term reputation while we've got that covered. What parts of our research portfolio, if you like, can we look to and say, okay, let's have a strategy for these particular questions because they naturally are in tune with the community or end users, and then think about how we design the project so that while hitting our scholarly goals, we're doing the best we can, and in a sense hopefully optimising on engagement and impact? Well, the second hardest, at least in terms of the theme here, is delivering, and delivering on both the scholarly and the engagement goal. So if you don't have a strategy, this would be my argument, around engagement and impact, then in terms of delivering on I&E, so engagement and impact, it will just end up being random and serendipitous. And if this is the space you want to be in, having something that's random is not really very good, is it? So pitching research for engagement and impact is all about having a strategic approach to it. And so the strategy revolves around a tool that I want to share with you, and that's where we're heading now. Should we all have an engagement and impact strategy? Probably. But one size does not fit all. So you think of a spectrum between you've almost got no stake in the engagement and impact to you're right over at the other extreme where that's your main driver, and you just want to make sure that you're not too far away from scholarly goals. So it's a decision that we all need to make in terms of where do we fit within the bigger picture. For you, there's layers. It's like an onion. The bigger picture, the next sort of layer is within the institute, and then outside of the institute it's sort of the broader institution. So not everyone has to be stars, but a lot of us have to be seen as contributors, particularly I think here where you would have more of an engagement and impact imperative. Alright, we'll skip over that. Deciding factors, so personal career goals, the trade-offs, the discipline area you're in. So some discipline areas it would just be a really dumb idea to spend too much time thinking about this, because it's, you're either doing something that's highly conceptual, analytic, and it just won't work. But even in those disciplines where it does make a lot of sense, some topics are very amenable and others not so amenable. The other one to bear in mind is the life cycle of of the academic career. So advice I often give, which not all of my colleagues agree with, is when you're very early on, it's probably, unless your PhD is, this is the centre of it, then of course it's very important. But excluding that situation, I would recommend young scholars keep well away from these until they've established their academic cred, and then they can get into this. As I said, I have colleagues that I've probably never agreed with, and I've never seen two academics agree before, so it doesn't really bother me. Alright, so let's skip over that. What I want to quickly share with you, and then we'll go on to the engagement and impact side. I've got two tools, basically, two template tools. And so the base paper that I was talking about establishes and develops the scholarly tool, the scholarly pitching research tool, which is the one I've got on the slide at the moment. So normally in the talk based on this one, I spend quite a bit of time going through this and giving an example around this. So I'm going to skip over it reasonably quickly because I want to spend most of the time on the second tool, which is a companion to this one. So basically here we have 11 items that the researcher is challenged to complete. And my rule of thumb is I'm going to give you 1,000 words, and if you think in terms of pages, it's 2 pages. And this is sort of a bit of reaction to me as a grumpy old professor, where I've had many students that early on in our relationship, they want to give me a brain dump of, 20, 30, 40, 50, I've seen it all, pages. And it's a really bad strategy. It just brings out the grumpiness in me. And I'm trying to be a better person, but I just can't do it. So I figure a much better strategy is, at the beginning, just give me the core pieces that I want to know about, and it can start a conversation. So this is the structure that works for me. In terms of the way I've written up the paper, well, the current version of the paper has a slogan. It has a few slogans actually, but one of the slogans is a 3-2-1 countdown, but it's going to be a 4-3-2-1 countdown in the next version, because the 4 comes from the first 4 items, which I view as like a framing of the scholarly research. So if we're thinking of a PhD student, I want them to tell me a working title. Pretty obvious, but I've had plenty of students that just run away from that, to the extent that they'll send me something and it's chapter 2 of their thesis, and the title they've given it's chapter 2, and they can't understand why that makes me grumpy. But we won't go there. So the working title, basic research question, 3 key papers, and the motivation and puzzle, scholarly motivation and puzzle. And so as a package, that 4-piece to me frames what the scholarly research is about. The 3-2-1 is then captured by the next 6 items, which are basically the engine room of the template, the core of it. So there's a 3-piece, a 2-piece and a 1-piece. And so in a sense it's becoming progressively more challenging to convey some key dimensions of what it is you want to do. So the 3-dimensional challenge, you tell me about the core research idea, the data, and the tools. The 2-dimensional challenge are the 2 key questions. What's new and novel? And why is it important? So what? And then if you were to be asked in one sort of concept, tell me about the research and why I should take notice of it, well, to me that is explain to me what the contribution, well in this case, what the contribution will be, because the research hasn't been done yet. This is a planning tool. So in the core paper on the SSRN, I go through and just give a variety of advice around these, explain them, and that's not the goal today. That's today is just to give you a flavour of this, but to use this then to launch into the companion tool, which is engagement and impact tool. And then there are other considerations, which I talk about in the paper. So the main message that comes from that is less is more, structured less is more. And that carries over to the engagement and impact tool. So if we're thinking about something that would have a similar design, what would it look like? So one way of thinking of what we'd be trying to do with this second tool, it needs to be compatible with the scholarly research, which we set up in the first tool. It has to have a focus on broad societal impact and or engagement. So it's something that gets us in the intersection of those 3. And if we're not in the intersection, then we've missed the mark. So I admit this is a little bit contrived. It's more contrived than the first one, but I think it still works. And it works partly because it's building on, I guess, a familiarity that you get from thinking in a structured way that I've got in the first tool. So on the face of it, it looks like there are about 3 elements of this that are totally repeats of the prior one. While the labels are similar or the same, the way and the language that you would use to complete this one could be quite different. So the first one that hits us is a working title here. to me, the working title for this one could be quite different to the scholarly one. It shouldn't be so different that you look at them and go, oh, okay, that just there's no connection at all. Now, the example I'll show you a little bit later, and it's not an example I developed, it's a colleague of mine who very kindly has let me use this example. She actually has the same title in both, but I don't think that's necessarily needed, but it just so happens that's what she's done. So we've got the first four items here that we have the working title, the basic impact goal. So previously it was the basic research question. We have key industry and external triggers. Previously it was the 3 key papers. We've got motivation problem here. Previously it was motivation puzzle. That on the face of it looks like a total repeat. But to me, the language that you use here in terms of a planning device will be a little bit different and will give you much more of the real world sort of focus as opposed to the previous one, which will be more conditioned around the scholarly research and the scholarly thinking of that area. Then we depart quite a bit from the previous one, so the focus here is on thinking about stakeholders, or in the language of the ARC, I guess that's the end users, but let's stick with stakeholders. The value proposition and resources. So you can see quite a few of the things you suggested, either with the same terminology or similar terminology, are captured in this framework. A communication strategy and metrics. So there was suggestions around metrics and measures. And then a single sort of statement around what is the core impact that you think you're trying to, or you will be able to achieve, and some other considerations. So if we wanted to juxtapose the two, we have it there, and as we've already noted, the ones in green appear to be replicas, but they're not necessarily so, and very likely not perfect repeats of one another. So if we wanted to think about the engagement and impact framework, and I guess queue up a few thoughts in our mind as to what we would populate in each of the cells, then that's what we've got on this slide in terms of the first four. So in terms of the working title, a succinct informative title here, a title that emphasises the impact agenda in mind. The basic impact goal, it sounds a bit grand and literally is a bit over the top, but how will you change the world? Now in a lot of cases, we're not really going to change the world very much, but our world could be just a little small part of the real big world. So how will you change the world that's relevant to you? The key industry and external triggers, identify up to 3 key industry or external triggers which most critically underpin the topic. For example, they could be highly relevant or credible or influential industry reports, government inquiries, publications, reports, and sometimes, and I think this was mentioned in terms of the controversial nature of some of the things that we'll do, something that's controversial or attention-grabbing, an event that helps to give a trigger to what it is you're trying to do. In terms of the motivation or the problem, in a short paragraph describe the real-world problem. So again, that resonates with what was being suggested earlier when I asked you about those challenges. And it's very likely, I guess not 100% guaranteed it will be, but very likely it's going to come from a real world problem that you're trying to address. Okay, in terms of the stakeholders, or as the ARC would say, the end users, the suggestion is to think about maximum 3. But because there's a number of dimensions to the stakeholders, I would even probably go to the extremes view of just thinking about the key stakeholder. So what's the number one key stakeholder that you're trying to hit? Not literally hit, or target. And then think about these questions. What is their interest in the problem? What steps are they currently taking to try and solve it? What would a win look like for them? So we try and conceive of what a win would look like, so that when it happens, we know that we've had success. What are the knowledge and expertise gaps that they currently have? And this ties into the obvious one that was suggested earlier about funding. So in this case, well, would they be willing to invest money in solving the problem? And mostly we'd like to think yes, but maybe quite a few of these end users or stakeholders actually don't have funding themselves. And that's probably the case and relevant to what many of you sort of confront in this environment, that some of the stakeholders have very limited resources. An interesting one is, can they block a solution? Which surprised me. A lot of this came from Tim's sort of experience and suggestions, and I hadn't really thought of. I suppose I have a fairy tale view of the world. So why would anyone or anything want to block a solution if you've got a solution? But then if you think about it just for a very short time, you realise that there could well be conflicting interests. And so someone might want to block it because of self-interest, basically. And it's good to know or think that out before you get there, because if you haven't thought it out, then it's going to be a bit of a shock when you try and create a solution, come up with a solution, and then suddenly there's this blockage. So how do all the stakeholders relate and interact? So there might be a bunch of stakeholders, and I guess a way of characterising it is they might be cooperative or they might be competitive. And if you had to guess, in a lot of cases, maybe it's more likely there's going to be competition. Well, then that'll get back to, is there some blockage that could happen for you? So that's the stakeholders. The value proposition. So for each stakeholder, but if we've only focused on the number one, then it's just that number one stakeholder. Identify the value that the research or the work that you're going to do can provide them. And frame this in their needs and relating to their problems. So not from your perspective, it's from their perspective. How are they going to relieve a pain for them or create a gain? And so we'd be trying to say something in this space that tells us the core value proposition. The resources. The one that will always come to mind is the money. But when you think about it, it's much more than the money, although some of these might be converted into money. Time, money, people, intellectual property, commercialisation skills and the like. So and very likely in a lot of these cases, we'll need a bunch of these resources. So the question then is, how are we going to access these resources? Are we going to go down a path of grants, partnerships, philanthropy, internal university capabilities, commercialisation, revenue? So what are they? There's a few suggestions there. So we then go to what we've labelled the two impact signals. Communication strategy. So how will stakeholders find out about your work? And this is not just your key stakeholder and even your top three. It's sort of all stakeholders or end users. So which channels will you use? So it's not meant to be an exhaustive list, and in fact, I'm going to show you some more information from the ARC, which is, I think it starts to get to be exhaustive. But let's look at what we've come up with. Industry publications, social media, general publishing through newspapers or conversation, for example. Public talks and presentations, mentoring stakeholders, advisory group participation, consulting, partnerships and joint ventures, and collaborative problem solving. The metrics, and that was also one that was suggested earlier. So how will you know it's working, and what are the metrics that you would be able to observe in some way to have some an evidence base that you got engagement and or impact. So publication reach, social shares, the extent to which social media is being utilised, the people you've directly spoken to, the revenue you're getting from consulting or commercialisation, direct impacts on people and organisations. Now the ARC in the pilot and the material that they put out with the pilot give a whole bunch of extra things for us to think about. So in the next version of this particular paper, we'll with acknowledgement have to bring a lot of these in, but engagement indicators that the ARC point us to are patents and patent citations, which I think for most of us, although maybe some, I think it's more the sciences, right? We're very unlikely to be able to play in that space. Research output analysis. And there's some interesting ones here, and what I worry about them is that human nature is that I could see a lot of academics just playing some games. So end user co-authorship. We could easily think of situations where some of our colleagues, but that could be some academics that we know have some end-user relationships, and they basically say, look, I'm writing this paper relating to the work we're doing for you. You've given great input to this, so I think you should be a co-author. And of course their name goes on it, and they basically do little or nothing to warrant the co-authorship. So clearly that's not a good way of doing it. What the ARC would be hoping is by nominating that metric and a few others, it actually induces meaningful behaviour as opposed to sham or invented. Anyhow, we have end-user co-authorship, end-user co-funding, open access publications. That one's interesting. We understand why they would head down that path of open access. The problem is there are two types of open access journals. There are the reputable journals and the predatory journals. And so we need to make sure that if we make our research available in open access publications, it is done in a way that avoids the predatory. Research income analysis. The traditional focus for universities is category 1, say ARCs, NHMRC. There's certainly been a big change now, and it's coming through in documents like this from the ARC, basically saying the category 2, 3 and 4 will in some sense get some sort of equal footing, although we're not quite sure how this will play out. End-user co-supervision of HDRs, so PhD students, again, it's reasonable in concept. I worry that it could be abused, however. Now there's an Appendix E from the materials that I've been referring to, where there's this big shopping list of things, and we won't go through it in detail, but number of contracts of research, consulting, expert witness and testing, number of licenses and assignments and options, donations, and so it goes on. So there's quite a a range of things, at least in terms of the pilot exercise, that they're signalling could well be part of the ongoing assessment of engagement and impact. And it goes on the next page as well. So there's many things that we could think about in terms of what an engagement or impact success might look like. In terms of impact indicators, there's three dimensions to this: approach to translation, the impact of the research, and the underlying research itself. So in terms of approach to translation, the extent to which there's institutional support, interaction with end users, how, the evidence of engagement to achieve the impact. So I think, as I was suggesting earlier, it's reasonable to think of the engagement as the path towards having impact. But impact to me is such a long-term thing and very difficult to demonstrate that any particular piece of research has had an impact, particularly in situations where there's a degree of competition. So you're working in a space and so are a number of other teams. And so, sure, maybe you can point to a particular event that has come about because of your team's efforts, but in a lot of cases there might be a gradual change which has really been influenced by a range of, and a collective force. So the evidence of engagement to achieve impact is tricky. This evidence of the review processes, a lot of it would be indirect and somewhat circumstantial. But nevertheless, the ARC is wanting us to show that.
Where will the matrices fit in here?
The metrics?
Yeah, because that has been the traditional measure of impact, right? Or it's not part of impact anymore.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, it's quite challenging, isn't it? I think, this comes from the ARC, and I suppose this is their suggestion of the indicators. So, when in terms of the pilot, I think they're really after some case studies, some more narrative, and fortunately, I think the expectation is that there'll just be a small set of these case studies that each institution needs to put forward. So mostly we won't be bothered with this. It's only if our institution says, hey, you've got a really good example. In that case, you need to write up something that, as best you can, speaks to many of these dimensions. But this is what they're saying are the indicators.
I think this stuff's really good in terms of my research. I think there's been a bit of a slant towards more scientific type research, and where the metrics does help. But when you're in social research, this is the stuff that's going to help us to do that sort of thing.
It has moved quite a great deal, not only through the ARC but also through the funding as well. When you change legislation, as funding is moving more towards more qualitative now, which does help our science research.
Yes, sorry. My only question is, suppose as a researcher I need to provide evidence of impacts, and within this framework, how can I bring in the matrices? Is that an indicator at all, or is it that's my point?
Would it be the second dot point in number 2?
In the interaction with end users.
Nature and
type of impact.
And the
Impact
extent.
of research and extent.
So who, what, where, how, and why.
See impact of research. So you've got to work through the
All right.
So,
but this is at a university level. The university will
Decide.
do this. Yeah, this is not from individual research.
No,
so
no,
it's
no.
still important you're doing what you're doing, and those metrics are important. But the university will.
University, and they're going to cherry pick
They will cherry pick.
the best examples, and so that probably many of us will never have to worry about that exercise. But that, I think it's still important for us to know what they're generally after, so that when you know, between the formal sort of assessment exercises, they're looking for a range of the troops to be doing certain activities that are in tune with this broad objective. And so I think knowing about it and knowing what are the likely things they're going to be looking for is very useful. So going back to the template tool, the impact, what is the primary essence of the impact? State this in one or two focused sentences. And other considerations, so the two things we draw out here that are different from the scholarly other considerations is thinking about IP ownership and commercialisation. So it would seem in those projects that will really have something worthwhile to say regarding engagement and impact, IP ownership and commercialisation could be very, very critical, very sticky, very problematic actually. My limited experience, but what I've heard others say is this can actually slow things down incredibly. So the extent to which you might be able to plan for it and resolve some of those things earlier, I'm not sure, but it probably can't hurt to be thinking about them. So that's the framework. What I wanted to now do was pitch you a particular project in the two forms, but I'll mainly focus on the latter one, the engagement and impact one, but I don't want to totally fly through the scholarly one, because as I argued, the two need to be seen as compatible. At least that will be my view. If you were to totally ignore the scholarly one, then you could easily find yourself just doing a consulting piece or a very gun for hire type piece, which there'll be some value, but you wouldn't want to overproduce on that. So I have to thank Kathy Walsh from the ANU, who's in the finance department there, associate professor there. And the quick background of this is Kathy, so this is reverse engineered. So it's actually she's reversed back into the framework a project that she completed, which she felt would work very well to illustrate how this all goes. And so she was involved in this project that was sponsored by the New South Wales government. And it was all about whether Sydney as a financial centre could make a case for being one of these hubs where the Chinese currency would really have some strong trading capability and in a sense, I guess, compete or take some of the business away from the US dollar. So I think we all intuitively know that in terms of, say, foreign trade and whatever, and contracts, the go-to currency is the US dollar. All right, and China, while it's been a very closed economy for quite a while, in recent years and decades, in various ways, it's moving to, in its own way, become a little bit more international and global in its thinking. Not perfectly so, and one of these is recognising that, or particularly because it trades heavily with a number of nations, it would be, there's a potential for it getting a big piece of this, basically foreign exchange action. And to make it totally global, they would be looking for a range of key financial centres around the world to enable this. And so Sydney was one of, I think, more than a dozen, actually, that were sort of vying for this. And I don't think the dust has settled on it yet. But Kathy certainly has delivered a report to the New South Wales government to help them understand this. So It's internationalisation of the RMB, implications for Australian financial markets. And so the scholarly pitch is, first of all, starts off with a research question. Well, there's a bit of a blurb there, but here's the essence of it. To provide a clear understanding of where the main opportunities lie and how Australia could best interact with existing offshore centres and hubs in the region and beyond. The three key papers are ones that are a little different to what we normally see in a scholarly pitch, and I think it reflects the fact that this particular project is very much a real-world driven project. And so the scholarly pieces are not as scholarly as we normally see. So we normally expect to see them from highly recognised journals in the literature. But here we have some, a report, an RBA bulletin piece, and in fact there's only two of them. So the first one provides a broad overview of the internationalisation of the RMB and its implications for Australia. The second one, I guess, very carefully tells us that there's a balance going on here. It's not clear-cut, but a clear-cut case that the New South Wales government should jump into this and that it would make sense. So it says that notice that the proportion of Australian trade with China that is invoiced and settled in the RMB is very small. It's less than 1%. Now, given how big the Chinese economy is and how much trading they do, it's easy to see that there's a big upside potential. But as it says there, this could mean either that the opportunities for the RMB business in Australia are very small, or that there's considerable scope for growth. And so we shouldn't bring to this a view of, well, the temptation from the New South Wales government is the latter, that there's considerable scope for growth and let's just go for it. It might be that the opportunities are just very small and they should recognise that. In terms of the motivation puzzle, it just says a little bit here about this competitiveness in terms of possible financial centres, jostling for this offshore hub. Do the centres compete with each other for the same business, or do they specialise? What is the nature of the financial links between these centres? How can Australia best take advantage of and fit into the existing network? So what's the idea? So RMB's internationalisation is moving at a fast pace and is without precedent, so the quantitative investigation techniques are not applicable. So it's right for study, but from a qualitative point of view, and this is exactly what they did. They conducted in-depth interviews with key players in this space, so officials and practitioners in RMB centres around the world, and you can see the likely suspects, or the usual suspects are there: Singapore, Hong Kong, Seoul, Shanghai, Frankfurt, Luxembourg, London and Paris. So there's significant competition there for Sydney. And their plan, or what they did, because they reverse engineered this, is benchmark the data against domestic participants to determine the scope of business in Australia. So the data will be drawn primarily from interviews, but is supplemented by other data, essentially from the Reserve Bank and some other financial institutions. And the tools are essentially content analysis of the interview data, triangulated with the official data. So what's new? The previous papers are the only papers that look at this question of the internationalisation of RMB in an Australian context, but neither of them look at the competition with other RMB centres. So the particular focus of this piece, and if you like, the novelty, is how will competition have an impact on the way forward? So what? Well, there's a big so what here for the New South Wales government. You can imagine that if they decided to go ahead with this and they actually get chosen to be the hub, then there's a huge windfall of business and an activity, economic activity heading towards New South Wales and obviously particularly Sydney. So the contribution of this research will be the first independent report identifying the potential financial market opportunities and required policy changes. Other considerations, the one that Kathy highlights here are the political sensitivities. So it's easy to see that any research you do that involves China, given the history and the nature of that economy, would be one where certain things need to be handled in a very sensitive way, and if you don't get that right, then you could be in a bit of strife. All right, so what's the engagement and impact pitch? Same title as I said, but it doesn't necessarily have to be so. The basic impact goal, this research will provide financial market policy recommendations to enable Australia to benefit from the opening of China's capital markets and the internationalisation of the RMB. The key industry triggers, first piece there is out of the trigger from the Reserve Bank of Australia. So it's published several bulletin articles looking at exactly this issue, and noting here that there, as I said earlier, there's considerable scope for growth. The second one is a recognition of the RMB market as one of the fastest growing currency markets in the world, and there's a few reports that have been commissioned, so HSBC being one notable one that draws attention to that. And the third piece is around these dialogues, so the RMB trade and investment dialogues that Hong Kong and Australia have held, and there have been 3 of those, at least at the time of writing this. So the dialogues focus on investment and funding opportunities associated with the internationalisation of the RMB. So that's a third trigger. So a trigger revolving around work the RBA have done, a trigger revolving around some work that HSBC and other commission reports have done, and these dialogues that involved at a very high level between Hong Kong and Australia. So there's an imbalance between Australia's trade and financial relationships with China. While China is Australia's #1 trading partner, our financial relationships remain with US and Europe. So, as history shows, finance follows trade, and as a trade relationship with China deepens, trading firms will require an increasing number of financial contracts and more substantial levels of two-way investment. So China's trading partners could benefit substantially from this opening up of So the stakeholders, clearly the #1 stakeholders in the New South Wales government, and indeed they were the ones that engaged Kathy and her team to work on this. So the thing about that they had to take into account was it's very likely the government could just see this as all positive, and the team had to take that into account, but also deliver something that would be balanced and make sure that the extent to which there are negatives or risks here, these are being noted and recognised. The other stakeholder, and an important one as well, of course, is the federal government. Why have they got a role to play? Well, some of the things that would need to fall in into place are under the control of the feds, so tax and regulatory frameworks. There's not a day go by where if we pick up the newspaper, we're told that we're increasingly uncompetitive in terms of international taxation and the like. So, if the federal government were able, and I mean there's a big if there, because they might want to do something, but if it gets blocked in terms of the way in which the current situation is with the problem with the Senate, then they could have a few difficulties. But the two key stakeholders, the main ones, the New South Wales government and also the federal government. So what's the value propositions from the New South Wales government? The major driver behind the push for Sydney to be this hub. While Sydney is a natural home for the Australian hub, it's in competition with 17 others around the world. So business will not naturally flow to Sydney unless the right policies are in place. Only 1% of Australia's trade with China is currently settled in the RMB versus an estimated 30% in RMB of China's total trade settlement. So there's basically 1% it looks like it could grow to 30%. So if everything lines up and that growth is put into place and they do get the hub, then clearly the New South Wales government will see a lot of value in this. The resources, so the report which they've now delivered, if we're thinking about a planning document here, they plan to, it would take 12 months, 60% full-time equivalent. Would involve on-site interviews with officials, market sector people around the world. So they felt it necessary and important to travel, to talk to the different players globally. So there's a substantial travel budget that they needed and they actually had. The research needs to be verified by the R&D committees in each of the hubs and checked for government sensitivities. And in terms of their research assistant, they need a bilingual person, strongly bilingual in Mandarin and English. And there was a combination of grant funding and ANU resources because ANU is Kathy's employer. All right, the communication strategy. So there's a few levels here. R&D committees have been formed in each of the hubs and are eager to engage research on R&D growth. Kathy's team have a maintained database over 4 years, so they've got a list of 300 people interested in reading the research. So they've now sent out the research and those 300 people would have received it. They engage a PR firm, a public relations firm, to handle the launch. And there were media releases in both English and Mandarin. They've been invited to talk on the issue at government level dialogues and industry conferences. And they'll continue their involvement with bank-led roadshows. So the metrics. Policy adoption at the state and federal level would be the sort of killer, and that would be a clear indicator of success. Government adoption of targets, incorporation in government-led dialogues. So incorporation of their report is what we're talking about here. Media reach by total viewer readership and the number of words in leading publications, and citations in financial market publications. So in terms of the impact statement, the recommendations stemming from this research will allow Australia to fully benefit from China's financial development. The implementation of the policy changes at the state and federal level will signal the deepest impact of this research. So, other considerations. As I indicated way back at the beginning of outlining this pitch example, a drawback of the research is it's highly unlikely to be published in A-star journals. So it's very practically relevant, but it doesn't have the rich and deep scholarly elements that would appeal to the very best journals. That's just the nature of the beast. In addition, some of the policy recommendations will be unpopular, politically or expensive. So the communication management is a key. So that's basically an example of the pitch, or the paired pitch, so the scholarly pitch and the engagement and impact pitch. And hopefully you can see how the two work together. But the engagement and impact one has a very much practical focus. It's trying to hit at many of the issues that were identified and that you suggested right at the beginning before we even had a look at the framework itself. So hopefully you found or would find that useful in terms of the work that you do. And finally, I wanted to leave you with is just an indicator of the different resources that, so PR stands for Pitching Research here, not Public Relations. There's quite a bit of material that hangs off my webpage at UQ. And it's pretty easy to find because my name is very unusual, so there's no other Faff at UQ, so it's not too hard. But as I said, if you get these slides, if you hover over the, I guess it's mauve or a light mauve web page, it will, and you click on that, it will send you to the web page. There's an online library, which I've got about 160 examples now. Almost all of these examples are the scholarly pitch. I just can't remember whether I've got any of the engagement and impact pitches up there, but all of, I'd say most of them, the vast majority are scholarly ones. There's a web portal which only provides a framework for the scholarly pitch at the moment. We're in the process of enhancing it so that you can do the engagement and impact pitch there as well. Some videos. Thankfully, there's only a few of myself. There's quite a few videos of some students pitching their work. So if you wanted to see or have a look at those, you're very welcome. The other thing I draw your attention to is there's a range of papers in the stable. The most recent one that I got a first version out while I've been travelling is one where we include a range of different language translations of the scholarly pitch. So the logic here is to increase the discoverability of research that has been published in languages other than English. So the first version of it, we've got a Chinese version, a Spanish version, and Chinese, Spanish, and Vietnamese. I've got promises of 12 others, of which I've had delivery of 3. So I've got a Portuguese one, a Hindi one, and I can't remember what I've got, a third one that's already been delivered. So that one's quite an interesting little and hopefully exciting and useful addition to the papers and resources that I've made available. Anyhow, thank you for lasting a distance. I hope that was of some interest to you and some assistance going forward in terms of doing research that's not only scholarly in nature but also has engagement and impact. Thank you.